Hello, everybody. It is Monday, June 15th. Welcome to our, I believe, 10th installment of talking about politics here during the COVID-19 era in America. Just a quick note, I think this is going to be our final installment for a while. We're summer departures coming up for us, and we're going to take a break. We will reserve the right to maybe do something else if, or come back a little bit early if circumstances warrant. But I think we'll sort of plan on resuming in August otherwise. How are you today, Dad? I'm Keir Murray. I'm a Houston-based political and public affairs consultant. I'm joined by Richard Murray, a UH political scientist. How are you today?
Fine. I'm fine.
Okay. Well, lots going on, as it seems to be the case every week. I thought I would start out with news from the Supreme Court this morning. I think largely considered a landmark ruling on workplace discrimination and granting LGBT Americans standing to file discrimination lawsuits based on employment discrimination around sexual orientation. 6-3 ruling by the court. Justice Roberts and Gorsuch joining the liberals on the court in this ruling, I think, which surprised some. But it just goes to show you that the court is not always as conservative as it's assumed to be. Any thoughts on this ruling, Dad?
Well, I'm not surprised at Roberts. Roberts is an institutionalist. He's very concerned about preserving the long-term legitimacy of the court as not being a political hack institution. You know, he's still a relatively young Chief Justice, although he's been on the bench for 13 years. And I think he plans on trying to be a great Chief Justice like Earl Warren and John Marshall. So I think he's, going to pick his spots carefully. We saw that, of course, 7-8 years ago when he upheld most of the Affordable Care Act to the dismay of much of the conservative political establishment. So Roberts is always somewhat unpredictable. Now that Kennedy's off the court, he is truly the swing vote. Gorsuch, of course, is much newer, on the court for a couple of years, but has a libertarian streak. And a lot of libertarians are pretty liberal on gay rights. They're not really that interested in government coming down on the opposite side of people who happen to have a different sexual orientation.
And of course, it seems Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion this morning, but, one of the selling points that conservatives have argued for, Donald Trump's reelection is his appointment of conservative judges up and down the federal bench. Gorsuch, of course, being one of them. But, one would imagine that social conservatives are less than pleased with this ruling this morning. And I think they've already distrusted Roberts because of issues like the Affordable Care Act that you mentioned. But, Gorsuch was somebody I think that they would have considered reliable on these kinds of issues for them. And if he probably unpleasantly surprised them this morning, do you think that this kind of a decision has any even marginal effect on conservative enthusiasm for the president's reelection, given that this has been one of his strong selling points to social conservatives?
Probably some, but you've got these 3 800-pound gorillas in the ring, the virus, the collapsing economy, now the surge in concern about police violence directed toward blacks that are far bigger factors, in my opinion. This, I think, will largely pass by Election Day.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the president for a moment. Obviously, it's been a tumultuous time for the country, and I think for him included, it's pretty clear in terms of polling that he's received low marks from the public in response to the latest facet or crisis that's facing in his administration. As you mentioned, the demonstrations and outcry following police killings. And I wanted to focus on his conduct in response to that. As we talked about last week, he had sort of a photo op in Washington after speaking at the White House. It was very controversial, where police used tear gas and others to clear out demonstrators so he could walk over to this church and do a photo op. But this weekend, a little bit different. He's giving a speech at West Point to graduates of the U.S. Military Academy there. As we will remember, him making this speech was controversial when it was planned, because he was reconvening graduates at West Point during the coronavirus to come back so he could give this speech. But one of the speech in itself didn't garner as much attention as some focus on the president's health and well-being. He seemed to have difficulty raising a glass of water to drink, had to use both hands to do that, and then haltingly departed the stage, walking down I think a pretty gentle ramp. Didn't look sure-footed or comfortable. We've obviously seen the president in 2016 and his team make issue of Hillary Clinton's potential health issues, and those attacks have extended to Joe Biden, suggesting that he's not mentally or physically fit to be president. What do you make of the president's health itself, and how that might factor into the race going forward?
Well, when you have two presumptive nominees that are collectively over 150 years old, health is likely to be an unusually salient issue, particularly in the age of almost constant pictures. FDR was a severely disabled person after his polio attack when he was in his early 40s. But, there was never a photo of FDR being lifted physically out of a car and so forth. Television, of course, didn't exist. Nowadays, every moment you're outside is recorded by somebody. So it's given that Trump has been playing those cards himself, he's particularly vulnerable, and he just turned 74. And Biden is a very slender, sort of looks pretty athletically fit guy from where I sit. Trump, not so much. So it's an interesting question. And, most of us will make decisions based on our party identity and our policy positions, but the visuals matter. There are about 10% of voters that know very little about policy, and they're pretty much, disengaged from the political process. But if they see somebody speaking haltingly or misstepping, that probably has some impact there.
Yeah, and we remember, of course, about 6 months ago, the president was sort of very suddenly taken to Walter Reed. His staff didn't disclose much about it, except to sort of say this was a routine visit. Didn't appear that way to most people, and they've never really said anything more about it. Put on top of that the president disclosed a few weeks ago that he'd been taking hydroxychloroquine as a preventive measure related to COVID-19, which I think alarmed some people, given its less than proven effects in dealing with the disease, with the coronavirus. So it seems to me that this health and well-being question is likely to stick around. And again, this is largely an issue that the president himself has raised last election about Clinton, this time about Biden. And, I'm wondering if that's really one of the topics he wants this campaign to be waged on, because it seems like he's got some vulnerability himself politically in this regard.
Yeah. But, you can perhaps keep some things out of the public view, like not being fully disclosing the Walter Reed visit, but particularly in the height of a campaign where the president insists upon being visible in a traditional way, if there are any serious problems here, they're going to become evident to the public.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of the presidential race where we sit. As we mentioned the last few weeks, it's pretty clear that the president's standing in public polling has fallen, not just in national polls, but in battleground states as well. Harry Enton, who's a good analyst for CNN, wrote a piece I thought that was very interesting over the weekend, where he talked about the sort of in the age of modern polling since the 40s, I guess, or 30s, uh, the salience of a president's job approval rating and its relative stability this late in the race. He looked at 13 presidential elections since we've had modern polling and found that, generally speaking, in the last 4 months or so of the campaign, there's very little variation historically in a president's job approval rating. On average, it only moves about 3 points in either direction. There were a couple of exceptions to that. Harry Truman in 1948, and I think LBJ in 64, that had greater variation. But he says, President Trump's average job approval rating now is in the low 40s. So if it follows historical patterns, even if it were to go up some, probably only gets to the mid 40s, which would make his reelection difficult. Maybe not impossible, but not easy. And we found that job approval rating tends to be the most dispositive factor in terms of whether a president is reelected or not. What do you think about that sort of level of analysis and the historical stability of presidential job approval and how that affects reelection prospects?
Yeah, particularly where you have an incumbent president seeking reelection. Voters have now almost 4 years of information, and with Trump, 5 years of watching him as a candidate. So just a lot of is baked into the cake by this point. Trump is what he is. He has a passionate core of supporters who are going to vote for him. He has a passionate core of people who don't like him. Not very many people are persuadable or movable now, especially in that the opponent, Biden, is an unusually well-known opponent who's been a public figure for 40 years and twice before his run for president and served 8 years as vice president. So the argument that the numbers are pretty stable in a year like 2020 is a very strong one. Yeah, things can change, but that's usually some sort of outside unexpected event. And of course, we've seen those. We've had 3 of them happen here in 2020. The coronavirus, then the collapse of the economy, and then all of a sudden, a tremendous new focus on police African-American relations, triggered by the senseless, seemingly unending number of Black men being killed by urban police forces.
Yeah, and as we've talked about and related to polling, Biden appears to be doing surprisingly well with voters over 65 compared to how Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. But in a couple of areas, at least the polling I've seen shows him continuing to underperform with a couple of cohorts, younger voters and Hispanic voters, underperforming Clinton, I think, margins in both of those categories. What do you think about how that looks today, and whether we're likely to end up that way by November?
A lot depends upon what kind of campaign Biden wages, the issue positions he takes, and his choice for vice president. He's 77. He's not going to get any younger, but he has been developing a number of substantive issue positions, but he hasn't really rolled those out. He will be doing that along with his VP pick here through the summer, but he's got some ground to make up. It's not so much that he's at great risk of losing a lot of young voters to Trump, but this is the most difficult demographic to turn out, followed by Latinos. So he could have a massive stay-at-home problem that undermines his competitiveness in states where you have significant numbers of Latinos, like Arizona. The Democrats hope to put that state in play. It's now one of the most Hispanic states in America, and we'll get around to Texas, but obviously here, if Trump is benefiting from stay-at-home voters who are Black and or Latino and younger, it's going to be very tough for Biden to carry Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've talked in the past about the prospects for flipping the U.S. Senate for Democrats, which seem to have grown over the last few months, as you know, the president's job performance approval has waned. Saw an interesting poll out of Iowa this weekend, the Seltzer poll done for the Des Moines Register, which is a very considered the gold standard in Iowa politics. A very high quality survey showed freshman Senator Joni Ernst, Republican senator, trailing her Democratic challenger Teresa Greenfield by 3 points. That's pretty much in line with a couple of other polls that had come out within the last week or so. Of course, interesting to note that Trump carried Iowa by about the same margin as he carried Texas. I think even slightly more, about 9.5 points in Iowa, and about just 9 even, I think, here in Texas. What does that tell you about the prospects for potentially the Senate chamber flipping control, and what that Iowa result might mean for a contest in Texas?
Well, you have a relatively small number of Senate seats up in each election. This year it's 35, 23 Republican seats, 12 Democratic. Whereas for the House, you got 435 members. So uh, you get a much larger number of cases. But usually in the Senate, if there's some kind of national tide, it doesn't stop at the state lines. If the Democrats are having a strong performance again, and because there's not much difference now in how people vote for Congress and how they vote for president. There used to be a huge difference. You could run 15, 20, 25 points ahead of your presidential candidate. In 1972, Democrats swept Congress and Nixon won 49 out of 50 states. That's gone. Now people's vote for president is very often the same vote they cast for Congress. We live in a neighborhood here in Southwest Houston where that is not the case. We have a lot of split ticket voters, but there are only 2 out of 24 state house districts in Harris County that have a large enough number of ticket splitters to really make much difference. So I think all across the country, including in Iowa and Maine and Kansas, Arizona, Trump's performance is going to pretty much determine whether Republicans lose their Senate majority or retain it.
Yeah. And of course, one big difference, obviously, with Iowa and Texas, Iowa is obviously a much smaller state population wise, but it's one of the oldest and the whitest states in America, right? Whereas Texas is a much, much different demographic profile, uh, much younger, much more diverse in racial, in terms of race and ethnicity. So, different things going on in those two states, right?
Let's come back to a point you made a bit earlier that particularly compared to the last round where Trump did substantially better with older voters, which of course helped him win in these battleground states. And he's so far in polling not doing nearly as well. So let's think about one of the reasons for that, I think, is the virus. Uh, President Trump, of course, and Republican governors like Abbott here and DeSantis in Florida have been the big cheerleaders for reopening the economy. Polling shows the public's really closely divided on this. A lot of people saying we got to get back to work. We can't shut the economy down. Older voters, of course, are to a much greater degree retired, have some income security with Social Security and pensions, and they're in much less of a rush to get reopened because, as we all know, there's overwhelming evidence that seniors are far more at risk. And so if you look at this erosion of Trump's support, I think part of it is that the way the virus is playing out politically, that if you're really pushing to reopen the economy to get people out, this is not as nearly as attractive a solution to the average 75-year-old.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, as we know, as you mentioned earlier, um, seniors are much more likely to vote than younger voters, right? So
You know,
it seems this compounds the president's problem. If your most certain demographic of people to turn out, if you're struggling with those folks, where do you go to get uh, to offset that? And as you mentioned, it's hard to see him getting hordes of younger voters to suddenly decide they want to reelect him. So
the other shift, it didn't just start with Trump, but was moving in that direction, is years of formal education. If you look at who's most likely to vote, is people who's finished a lot of schooling, that are college graduates, post-college graduates. Uh, that used to be a pretty Republican constituency. The most educated suburban areas with higher income, a lot of traditional Republican voters. Trump has totally turned that world upside down. He is, does much better with people that didn't go to college or went to college but dropped out. It does far less well than Romney with people who have a couple of degrees. And a problem with that demographic is they are very, very high level of voters. And you compound that with the age factor, the uphill track he faces to getting reelected is very substantial.
Yeah. Let's turn to Joe Biden for a little bit, and the continuing speculation about who his vice presidential running mate will be. He's mentioned that he wants to make that decision by about August 1st, so 7 weeks, something like that. I think based on events over the last few weeks with response to police killings, we can say that someone like Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, her stock has probably fallen greatly. And in fact, I read something over the weekend that says she's basically off the list now, whereas some other folks have been now elevated in terms of their prospects. One of those being Keisha Lance Bottoms, who's the mayor of Atlanta. I think has gotten good marks for her leadership in response to this outcry over police killings. Where do you see the Veep stakes sitting as we are now?
Well, I think it's moved the needle in favor of the African American women that are on the list to the detriment of the white female contenders. Possibly Elizabeth Warren, I think, still is a short lister because she has an unusual base of appeal to a lot of folks who didn't vote for Joe Biden in the primaries. But I think it's advantaged the prospects certainly of Senator Harris. But now also we've talked before about Val Demings, the congresswoman from Orlando, and 27 years a police officer and a police chief, her husband's also been a police chief, African American, of course. Now we have the 50-year-old mayor of Atlanta that's getting a lot of scrutiny, Keisha Lance Bottoms. We're just learning some things about her. She hasn't been vetted yet. The press will now turn their attention to her in the next weeks. She's obviously a quite attractive, vigorous woman who is, I understand, 50, but looks to me about 40. Georgia's a state that's coming into play. So she'll get a serious look, I think. There's also some more talk about Susan Rice, the former security advisor to President Obama. And of course, Stacey Abrams, also Georgia, remains in the mix. But I think now we're probably looking at a 60 to 80% likelihood of an African-American woman being on the ticket. And most of the other chances is for Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah. And I think the only other candidate I've seen is the governor of New Mexico, right? Ms. Lujan Grisham, who I think is there was Senator Cortez Masto out of Nevada took herself out of contention. She had also been on the list, would have given you two potential Latina running mates. Yeah, very, very interesting. And, of course, a different party, but it seems to me if you're the Biden campaign, you want to avoid a situation like the John McCain selection of Sarah Palin in 2008, which I think most people in hindsight felt like probably didn't benefit him as a candidate. That you want to make sure that vetting process for someone who's relatively new on the scene is thorough, right?
Yeah, if you run for president before and been thoroughly vetted, obviously you're pretty much a known quantity, and that's the case with Klobuchar, with Elizabeth Warren, and Kamala Harris. But for the other folks, not nearly to that degree. And the less well-known you are, like Mayor Bottoms, the more intense the scrutiny is going to be, because that's a new story. You've got thousands of political journalists out there, and they're all looking to get their stories out. And there's always something about somebody if it's 50 years old or whatever, that is not going to look good. I mean, that's just the nature of life. And people that are public figures make decisions and get involved in this, that, and the other. And the press is really going to dig hard, as they should.
Sure. I wanted to turn closer to home here, and we haven't talked about it as much recently, but the COVID-19 problem hasn't gone away. We're approaching, I think, sadly, 120,000 deaths in the U.S. That pace has mercifully slowed down over the last several weeks, but it hasn't stopped. We've seen indications that in a number of states, including Texas, there have been some troubling increases in hospitalizations, in use of ventilators, that type thing. Where do you see the COVID-19 crisis in terms of it potentially coming back now or not going away, and how that continues to affect the political landscape?
Well, I think there was a quote from Dr. Fauci, who, I think understandably perhaps the most credible person in America, saying this is the nightmare that he's always really been concerned about: a highly infectious, often deadly, it's disabling disease that we don't have a therapeutic for to treat it. That we are racing to a vaccine, but the history of vaccine development is, that it's much, much slower than we would like. So it looks like for this political campaign season, which has been the focus, of course, of these sessions we've been having, the COVID-19 virus is going to be a constant. That people are going to be getting sick, they're going to be dying. It seems to me that the states that have reopened, some perhaps earlier than they should have, are dug in. Where it's almost impossible politically to go back to shutting down restaurants and beauty parlors and beaches. So the president, who was the number one cheerleader to open early, and state governors that, like in Georgia and Florida and Texas, that took the lead, they're pretty much stuck. None of us knows the course the virus will take. We hope it lessens and wanes and that the hospital system doesn't get overwhelmed, but it's a real worry. But we're not going to change policy. It seems to me that the Republican leadership has made their decisions in these states, and we're just going to have to plow ahead for the next 140 days until we finally get a vote.
Yeah, and I've noticed here in Texas that Governor Abbott has been pretty quiet about all this. He obviously got a lot of flack from the right when he initially did some of these closures in state, and they hounded him pretty intensively until he relented on that. But now we've seen local officials here in the Houston area, in the Dallas area, and others, just expressing great concern about increasing caseloads, and governor's not saying a whole lot, basically saying, well, he's concerned, but he's not alarmed, or he's alarmed, but he's not concerned. I can't remember which one of those, but he just looks like he's trying to thread this needle of not making anybody mad, right? And doing and saying as little as possible. I'm not sure what he might do in terms of actions, but I agree with you. I don't think he's likely to re-implement state closures absent some kind of just massive outbreak.
Yeah, and that would totally tank the economy if we have to. We're pretty much on a course now that until we get a vaccine, we're going to stick with what we've got, and that's likely going to mean a lot more infections and not perhaps an accelerating number of people dying, but it seems to me that we're on a track by election day to probably have 200,000 deaths in the United States.
Wow. And of course, there continue to be concerns about how the virus will impact the mechanism of voting. More mail ballot applications. The new clerk here in Harris County, I believe, sent a mail ballot application for the runoff to every voter in the county over 65, some 400,000 people or so, I believe. I'll be curious to see how many of them take advantage of that option related to the upcoming July runoff. We talked offline about the fact that, these runoffs tend to be pretty low participation affairs. My suspicion is just sending folks an application is going to drive up that turnout some from what we normally might expect.
Yeah, one of the factors there, of course, is that you can take your return mail to get on the list to get permanently uh, to get mail ballots. So I think that's an incentive to send this request back in. And if you get a ballot mailed to you, obviously there's a pretty good chance you'll take the time to fill it out and send it back, either for the Republican or Democratic primary. Not much going on except in a few congressional districts for Republicans, but we do have a statewide U.S. Senate race. Without this virus, we would have probably had 3, 4, 500,000 people vote. Now we probably, I think, may get 1 million. We
Wow.
had about 2.3 million people vote in the first Democratic round. Normally, we would see a huge drop off. Most of the local races are over, but I think we may get close to 1 million people voting in this runoff. Still not nearly what we had in March, but it's kind of an interesting dry run because this should be a relatively easy election to conduct for the in-person part of voting because there are not going to be any people lining up to vote. And we have extended the early vote window a few days, but let's see how many of these mail ballots are returned.
Yeah. And of course, on the flip side, where we might see this increase in participation for the runoff, one of the things we've noticed in Texas, as we've mentioned before, is that voter registration, which normally increases pretty dramatically in a presidential year, it basically ground to a halt over the last few months, almost no gains. Do you see that picking back up again before the fall, and what might that do to potential results in November if we don't see a big increase in registration?
I think it will pick up. First, a lot of the voter registration groups, starting with nonpartisans like the League of Women Voters, and then certainly with partisan groups, are going to really ramp up their online efforts because not being able to go out and door knock, but also we will see, I think, in Texas, a lot of schools reopening, universities. And so we will have some increased opportunity for on-site, in-person voter registration. Plus, this is a very interesting election. People that study turnout, like Michael McDonald at the University of Florida, say we're going to break all records. So there's a lot of basic individual voter interest. Uh, and so I think we'll tick back up, but we won't get to the 17 plus million that we expected to have registered as compared to about 15 million 4 years ago. We're about 60% to that increase. We'll probably add another 3, 4, 500,000. But more important than who registers is who votes. And so I'm less focused on registration. Texas has a pretty robust registration. The problem in our state has been very low turnout among registered voters. And, none of us knows how the virus is going to affect that. We haven't had an election since the virus because we postponed our runoffs. We'll get some information, in 3 weeks. We have the runoff scheduled. Early voting starts, the 30th of June?
29th, I think.
And
Yeah.
then we have the final election on the 14th of July.
Yeah, and my recollection is statewide, we were at about 16.2 million registered as of the March primaries. It's obviously been 3+ months since then now, but I don't think we've had a lot of gain since then. The other thing I'll be interested to see is that, particularly in our big metro areas like Houston, lots of moving around normally of people, right? Moving from one apartment complex to another, which sometimes gets people to re-register at their new address, not always. I'm wondering in the fallout from COVID if we're going to see fewer people relocating. Obviously, a lot of people have lost jobs. Unclear how many will be evicted from current living situations if they're not able to get meaningful employment, after some of this stimulus help wears off and or ends in a month or so. We may see less transients, right, among people moving, and I don't know if that has any effect on participation or registration or not.
And we have a lot of people, independently of the virus and the shutdowns that it's caused, we're seeing in Houston, particularly, a dramatic loss of jobs in the energy sector. And what happened in like the 1980s when we had a collapse in 86, and in areas like Alief, you had a massive outmigration of energy voters. There were no jobs, so they left. A lot of them had come to Texas from states like Florida and Michigan, and they went home. Now, I don't know how much of that will happen before November, but the energy jobs are not coming back before the election and probably not thereafter. So we're going to permanently lose a fair number of employed adults, previously employed adults, because of the changes going on in our economy.
Yeah, and we saw last week, of course, Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, make some remarks that tanked the stock markets. Basically suggesting that the economic pain that's going on is not going to be short-lived, and we're in for a rough ride over the next several years. I believe he's scheduled to testify to both houses of Congress this week, and is, I think, expected largely to say similar things. What do you see with the economy and how that will continue to affect political prospects for the president and others running for office?
Well, Powell has impressed me with his chops and his smarts, and he has some of the best professional economists. Some are volunteering their efforts in this crisis, but others are employed in the Treasury and at the Fed that he has access to. He's not running for office, so he has no reason to create, some kind of false hope situation. He's a realist, and the reality is we're in a terrible situation. We've already lost trillions of dollars of productivity that we're not going to regain. Some industries may never come back. I mean, you want to buy a shopping mall these days? I think pretty easy to get one. We're probably going to see a fundamental transformation of our economy in ways that are going to be perhaps beneficial to a few folks. Amazon's hiring, but detrimental to many others. And that will take, I think, years to shake out.
Yeah. Okay, let me get to a few questions here before we wrap up. Someone asks about these Antifa and QAnon distractions. What do you think they mean for politics, for the election campaign in the short term and as we head into the fall?
I think political junkies, political ideologues pay attention enough that they know something about what Antifa is, and some of these other groups that are kind of on the fringe. Most voters aren't that engaged or interested, and there's so many much more hugely impactful things in people's lives than worrying about these bit players. So unless you're watching Rachel Maddow or Fox News, you don't get there. So I think that it's something to talk about. The president has seized on Antifa, and particularly his comments about the 75-year-old individual that was pushed in Buffalo and suffered what appears to be a pretty serious injury. But I think if you did a poll on what the hell Antifa is, 85% of Americans would say, not sure about that one.
Yeah, and of course, QAnon is on the other end of the spectrum, is on the far right. We did see, I think, we've seen a couple of Republican congressional primaries over the last couple of weeks where followers, devotees of that strange philosophy have actually gotten the nomination for, I believe, in one in a Senate race and in another in a U.S. House race last week.
Yeah, in Oregon, you have a very fringy, but that's a state where it's unlikely the Republicans will win the seat. Remember 30, 40 years ago when the LaRouches were very active, they got their nominee for governor and senator chosen in the state of Illinois. This is a total fringe group within the Democratic Party that had incredibly weird ideas. There's still some on the left, but there are a lot on the right these days. And in low turnout primaries, you can often win the nomination.
Yeah, I think one was in Virginia, right? A congressional seat in Virginia last week. Where
he was a fluke candidate to begin with, though. There's an incredible, unlikely set of events that made him a congressman.
Right, and the the sort of Trump supporting incumbent was bounced out, and I give chosen at a convention, right? A
Right.
GOP convention, but very interesting. Someone asks if Biden selects an African American woman to be his running mate, how will that affect moderate Republican voters who maybe want to vote for Biden but are maybe don't want to vote for another African American president after Obama, assuming that Biden would only fulfill one term? Do you think that's a potential issue for winning some of those voters, those center right voters that Biden probably wants to do in order to win in November?
Well, these African American ladies that have been mentioned are all different, and I think some of them would play better than others to Republicans or normal Republicans that are thinking of crossing over and voting. And of course, you have to vote. You can't split your vote for president, vice president. You're voting for electors who have to vote for the ticket. I think it'll be a relatively minor factor. More important for Biden is trying to unify some of the disaffected or less than enthusiastic elements within the Democratic Party. Trump's doing his work with the disaffected Republicans.
Yeah, and we of course have, as we've talked about before, I think to the extent, if you're Biden, to the extent that this election is a referendum on the president and his performance, that's probably what you want if you're Biden. If you're the president, you want a contrast between you and your opponent, and that's what I assume see the Trump people increasingly try to do over the next couple months.
But I've been surprised. It seems to me the Trump campaign has wasted several weeks now of keeping the focus off Biden. It's just, if they're going to draw this contrast, get started on it. People are sort of locking in their vote decisions, but Trump goes off on these rabbit trails, like the stunt at the White House that have nothing to do with Biden. And he can just basically stay in the basement. And Trump's not drawing the contrast between himself and Biden. Most of his public comments are about grudges he holds. And that's not helpful to his campaign.
Yeah, and it seems from just things you read in the media that there's internal turmoil at the campaign, right? Some people who want to push the current manager and others out, and how involved Jared, the son-in-law, is going to be. And so the extent that they don't have their own campaign house in order while the clock is ticking, I agree. They're losing valuable time. And as we've said before, based on the way things sit now, the president has to change the trajectory of this campaign in order for him to win. Because if it stays the way it is now, he's not going to be successful in November. I think most people would agree.
We understand there's some bias in the Electoral College, but once you get a margin of more than about 4%, it doesn't matter. You're going to lose in the Electoral College. I mean, Republicans can obviously win in the Electoral College with running a point or two below the Democrats, but not much more than that. And if your polling average is 7 or 8 points down, the Electoral College is not going to save you.
Yeah. Well, obviously still a long way to go, but very interesting. Well, I think that's about going to wrap us up for this time. And again, our 10th installment of this, we're going to go on hiatus for several weeks. Barring something extraordinary, we might reserve the right to jump back into the fray. But otherwise, thank you to everyone. Thanks, Dad, for your participation. And we'll try to reconvene probably in August.
Yeah, maybe when we find out the VP choice and we know the ticket.
Sure.
Incidentally, final mention, it's not 100% sure that anybody will be on the ticket. Health issues could disqualify Biden or Trump, as we touched on. But Pence is not a 100%er to be on the ticket. One of the ways you could try to change the trajectory of the race, if you figure you're likely losing, is make a different VP choice.
Wow.
So
Right.
Don't throw that out.
Nikki Haley, right, former South Carolina governor, there's been some speculation that, and I guess she's still serving. She was serving at the UN as the U.S. representative.
She's a private citizen now.
Yeah, you've heard her mentioned as a possibility if Trump decides to dump Mike Pence, but who knows? Yeah, one thing we can be sure of is that there will be lots of interesting things that will happen over the coming weeks. That seems to be a given. So, okay. Well, thanks, Dad, and thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll probably see you in several weeks.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Have a good summer.